Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. You may remember that in my last episode I mentioned my belief that Plato's Symposium is really about the fundamental unity of the human soul or self. For me, this is really where it gets its power to speak to us, even today, or perhaps especially today, when the self can seem so fragmented, when it can seem, in a way, as though we're pulled apart, pulled from ourselves, and it's hard to get to our core. Not always easy to get to the heart of things or find the stuff of life, you might say. I'm looking forward to going through the text of the Symposium to explain Plato's solution of this problem. And I was initially planning to start in this episode, but it occurred to me that there was a topic I hadn't really finished discussing that's quite important, and I think I should finish that today. I'm referring to something related to what I talked about a couple episodes ago, this idea of being unsettled by old books. In that episode, I was talking mostly about the way this ancient Greek tradition of sexual relationships between adult men and adolescent males might repel or disturb us. But today I'd like to look a bit deeper into the Symposium for other things that might surprise us. It's full of them, which is one thing that I think makes it such an adventure to read. And I think this surprise that we experience is significant because it speaks to assumptions we've made about ourselves, about our own time. It might even unsettle those assumptions, and that might be a good thing, particularly one sort of master assumption that I'll get to later in this episode. For some reason, I think it's common for many of us in the West today to assume that older cultures had something reminiscent of a Victorian mindset almost, perhaps because the Victorian or maybe quasi-Victorian culture that we still saw, I think, in a way, even in the 1950s in some ways, remains what our culture of the last several decades since the 60s has been rebelling against, and against which it identifies itself. Perhaps quasi-Victorian isn't really the right term, but what I'm trying to get at here is this vague and probably not entirely conscious assumption that the old is by necessity burdened by arbitrary, and as Nietzsche would have said about Victorian morality, anti-nature conventions, and that really only the modern West, sort of exploding starting in the 60s, has enlightened itself to the point of divesting itself of these burdens and their hang-ups, you might say, and thereby fostering the flourishing of human nature. I think there's some truth to this, that in modern enlightenment has been real, but I also think we've been inculcated in this to the point where it's hardened into a dogma that makes too many easy assumptions about itself. We've been subtly brainwashed in a way, I think, even in this quite open, liberal, democratic society that in so many ways has been successful at solving human problems. But one of the wonderful things about a book like the Symposium is how it can erode these assumptions. I'll give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Even the very setting of the Symposium might come as a surprise to somebody who, particularly to those who may be new to ancient Greece or to old books generally. We might have assumptions, or old cultures, study of old cultures. We might have assumptions that they were staid in some way, that they wouldn't have had drinking parties, sometimes for days on end, gatherings that celebrated abandon, or you might say the Dionysian, that made space for this. Related to this, I think, it might come as a shock to us because of what we might assume about religion, that the Greeks would have seen absolutely no conflict with these gatherings as being religious. We may, in other words, bring assumptions about what religion is from Christianity, and I suspect maybe only one particular form of Christianity at that, the fairly recent form that it's taken in the Anglo-American world. When Socrates had reclined and dined with the rest, Apollodorus, as the narrator of the Symposium says, they made libations, those are the poured offerings to the god. The notes in my book actually say there would have been three, one to the gods of Mount Olympus, one to the heroes, and one to Zeus Soter, Zeus the savior. So they made libations, Apollodorus says. They sang a song to the god, that's presumably Dionysus, and did all the rest of the customary rites, and then turned to drinking. So social drunkenness here was in the context of worship. Actually, not just only of Dionysus, but of the supreme god. The same goes for eros. It may come as a surprise for us that for these people, eros is divine. Actually, I think one thing that is new in our time is the complete divorce of sexuality from divinity. I'd like to quote the American scholar Alan Bloom briefly here. He says, "There's no Greek word for sex, that late 19th century invention of sterile and timid imitations of science." The speech about the attractions of bodies is always, in the Symposium, is always in terms of either the god Eros or the goddess Aphrodite. This sense of the sacred and mysterious character of such attractions informs the discussion of them. The Greeks didn't make a distinction between the natural and supernatural. The gods were part of nature. That was my own interjection. This does not mean that any one of this group of friends believes that there actually are such tutelary divinities of desire, but their understanding of it is clearly affected by its allegedly divine origins. There's also, by the way, no ancient Greek word for religion, and actually at one point, one of the speakers, the physician Eryximachus, has to use a fairly long string of words to try to get this idea across, where we would use a single word, religion. He says, quote, "all the sacrifices and things over which divination presides, things concerned with the communing of gods and human beings with one another." That the concept could only be sort of extricated from people's minds using this long string of words, I think shows how intimately religion was enmeshed in Greek life. Anyway, I think another thing that might come as a surprise, again from nearly the beginning of the work, is the premise of this particular symposium, that they'll spend the whole time talking about eros. I think many of us might bring an assumption that our contemporary culture has been the first to really be capable of openly discussing the erotic, that people before our time didn't talk frankly about it. Related to this, we might also assume that our time is the first to be accepting of same-sex relationships. As I've mentioned, we'll see male-male sexual relationships discussed in this dialogue, either without judgment or mostly as actually superior to male-female ones. This is a drinking party devoted to discussions about eros, but male-female relationships or attraction comes up quite rarely, actually, in it. There's some mention of shame and ridicule attached to adolescent male relationships in the speeches, but they're also conveyed here as in some way the fullest expression both of eros and of masculinity. The speech of Pausanias famously posits two kinds of Aphrodites, a lower one that involves the love of bodies rather than souls, and is concerned mostly with the sexual act. This is associated with male-female relationships as well as those between men and youths. But there's a higher Aphrodite involving lifelong commitment and a view to the improvement of character. And this one is associated, according to Pausanias, only with relationships between men and youths. The young Phaedrus, the first speaker, assumes that Achilles and Patroclus, among the Greeks' greatest heroes, were lovers. It's never actually explicitly alluded to in the Iliad. Although it's impossible to deny that Achilles had very powerful feelings for Patroclus, there's no allusion to anything sexual in there. We might also falsely assume that ours is the first age to have seen the erotic as beneficial in some way. And so we may be surprised to read these speeches in which Eros is praised for many things as potentially spurring altruism, for example, in a sort of indirect way. According to Phaedrus, people in love want to impress each other and are fearful of being caught putting their self-interest ahead of the well-being of others. He says, if there were any possibility that a city or an army could be composed of lovers, erastai, that's the older partner, or beloveds, the Greek word is paidokoi, actually, which means children, boys, or youths, but also can mean darlings, maybe a bit, as we would say, baby for the romantic partner. Then there could be, so if there were any possibility that a city or an army could be composed of lovers or beloveds, then there could be no better way for them to manage their own city, for they would abstain from all that is shameful and be filled with love of honor before one another. And as many have noticed with respect to this passage, there was, as it turns out, exactly such a military unit at the time of Plato, the sacred Band of Thieves, which consisted of 150 pairs of male lovers, 150 each of erastai and eromenai, those the adult and adolescent males. And it seems to have actually been the city of Thebes' elite military unit. Anyway, in another speech, Pausanias, we've mentioned him before, he comes off as something of a legal expert because his speech focuses on political science. He describes Eros as inspiring self-liberation through the fostering of natural inclinations. He says, the Persian Empire, actually the Greek word is barbaroi, on account of their tyrannic rule, is absolute. That is why it condemns Eros, as well as philosophy and sport, philogymnastia, or you could say athleticism. It's no good for rulers if the people they rule cherish ambitions for themselves or form strong bonds of friendship with one another. These are precisely the effects of philosophy, sport, and especially of Eros. That's what Pausanias says. Similar observations have been made in our own times, that homosexuality was generally not tolerated in the 20th century, for example, by either Nazi or Soviet governments. And you may remember, if you've read the book, that at the end of George Orwell's 1984, the protagonist Winston and his lover Julia must betray each other for the victory of the totalitarian state to be complete. But such ideas about Eros, the Symposium shows us, aren't unique to our era. In other speeches, Eros is similarly described in ways that might remind us of modern trends, from the New Age movement to psychoanalysis. It's depicted as a cosmic force that transcends the merely human, as psychologically and spiritually healing. And ultimately in the speech of Agathon, the last to speak before Socrates, as the highest good, quote, the fairest and best guide, whom every real man must follow, hymning beautifully, and sharing the song Eros sings, in charming the thought of all gods and human beings. So, reading the Symposium, like so many old books, has the potential to de-brainwash us in a way by making us feel unsettled about the assumptions we've made that have maybe in a way been implanted in us about our time. And I think, as perhaps you may have guessed, the most important of all these assumptions, the sort of master assumption, is that we needn't look to the past for wisdom because modernity has all the answers. Often our assumptions actually run even deeper than this, the thought that we have all the answers. They run even to the point that the assumption that we're asking questions today that have never been asked before. Yet here in this book from 4th century BC Athens, we have a focus on this problem of self-dividedness or existential alienation that to some might seem a uniquely modern problem. But anyway, we don't have all the answers today. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, I don't believe we can find the unity, the real oneness we're seeking today. A unity that would also be true, not just a fleeting or illusory oneness. A unity that would be true. I don't think we can find that without some idea of the reality of goodness. But goodness is outside the sphere of science, and science has become a sort of paragon of objective knowledge for us and our default source of answers. This is also related to something else I talked about several episodes ago, the idea of history and the humanities in general, old books you might say, like going into a place where we'll find, like going into a descent into an underground treasure room. In other words, we're going to be going into a place where we'll find much that is alien, but also much that is precious, much that might astonish us for how relatable it is, and might undermine our uncertainties, might undermine our certainties in a good way. Next episode, let's start taking our first few steps down and dig into this text. Hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.